Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. It wasn't the snow, it wasn't the darkness, it wasn't even the bitter cold that made people in St. Anthony, Newfoundland, uneasy that morning. It was the silence, an unsettling, unexplained silence coming from a house where a woman should have been drinking coffee and texting her daughter like any other Thursday. Her car was in the driveway, her phone on the table, the lights still on. But Jennifer? Gone. She hadn't taken her purse. She hadn't messaged anyone. She hadn't checked out of her life. By all indicators, digital and physical, Jennifer Hillier-Penny had never left the house on Husky Drive. The call came in on the morning of December 1st, 2016. Around 7:50 a.m., her father made a 911 call after finding her car unmoved and the front door unlocked. He had dropped her off the night before. Now, she wasn't answering, and that wasn't like her. Not once in 38 years had she just vanished. RCMP patrol officers were dispatched immediately, given the weather and her recent history. When they arrived, nothing looked criminal. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle. The kitchen was tidy. Her phone lay on the dining table. Her overnight bag rested by the stairs. The only thing out of place was that Jennifer wasn't there. For investigators, these kinds of disappearances fall into patterns: voluntary, accidental, or forced. The first 48 hours were dedicated to ruling out the obvious. Did she leave of her own accord? Did she get hurt outside the house? Did someone come in? The trouble was, nothing fit. Jennifer's car key was in her coat pocket, which hung on a hook by the front door. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood showed no movement at her driveway after 8:40 p.m. Cell tower pings stopped just after 9 o'clock p.m. No cab records, no outgoing calls, no digital trail. As RCMP Corporal Green noted in his first internal report, if she walked out, she did it barefoot, without her wallet, in a snowstorm, and with no destination. That makes zero sense. The only known plan Jennifer had that night was to stay over and watch her youngest daughter while her estranged husband, Dean Penny, left for an overnight duck hunting trip at his remote cabin. The couple was in the process of separating. Jennifer had been living with her father since early November. Dean confirmed that he had left the house shortly after 7:30 p.m. and didn't return until midday the following day. His statements were measured, brief. He said he hadn't seen Jennifer after she arrived. She said she'd be fine overnight. He said she was gone when he came back. At first glance, his story held. The cabin was real, the hunting license checked out. There were even tire marks to support his departure time, but investigators weren't looking for alibis. They were looking for the thing that didn't match, and very early on they found it. Jennifer's phone hadn't left the house. Her iCloud didn't log out. Her Apple ID never changed location. The last data point showed it idle on Wi-Fi from 8:52 p.m. onward. At 10:06 p.m., someone turned off the Wi-Fi router. When it came back on the next morning, her phone had already powered down. More curiously, no one, not neighbors, not even the nearby gas station's night cam, caught any movement in or out of the Penny residence between 9 o'clock p.m. and 6:30 a.m. For a while, there was debate about whether this was a domestic matter or a criminal case. But Jennifer's family made it clear. This wasn't emotional. It was calculated. She was excited about life, planning a new start, focused on her daughters. She would never leave her girls. She would never do that to them, her sister stated in a public plea. If she was in trouble, she would have called. She always called. Investigators combed through everything inside the house: receipts, emails, browser history, trash contents, thermostat logs. There was nothing explosive, no struggle, no blood, no broken glass. But the absence of evidence wasn't absence of activity. That house was quiet in all the wrong ways. Forensic teams used luminol, blacklight sweeps, thermal imaging. Some smudges were found, but nothing substantial, nothing that would hold in court. Still, suspicions grew louder than facts. Dean Penny did not consent to a full forensic sweep of his truck, nor did he provide access to his personal devices. When asked to take a polygraph, he declined on the advice of counsel. That legally meant nothing, but in the context of a small town, it meant everything. You don't need a smoking gun to know something's off, a retired RCMP sergeant said, unofficially. Sometimes the silence speaks loudest. By the end of day 3, Jennifer's disappearance had escalated into a full major crimes investigation. Search crews combed shorelines, snowbanks, and side roads. Nothing turned up. There were no witnesses, no screams heard, no signs of Jennifer at hospitals, airports, or ferry terminals. Her bank cards weren't used. Her insurance remained untouched. Saints. Anthony, a town where people rarely locked their doors, had shifted into suspicion mode. The official word from RCMP at that stage was clear but limited. We are treating this as a missing person case with concerning circumstances. All avenues remain open. Unofficially, internal memos began to use the term probable homicide. Though no body had been found and no arrest made, the tone changed. That's what separated this case from others. It wasn't what was found. It was what wasn't. In true crime, the victim's name can get lost behind timelines, suspects, and forensic reports. But Jennifer Hillier Penny wasn't just a missing person case number. She was a mother of 2, a sister, a daughter, and a healthcare worker known for being steady under pressure. Her disappearance wasn't just about who might have taken her. It was about who she was before that night and what patterns in her life would later become relevant. Born and raised in the small northern community of St. Anthony, Newfoundland, Jennifer lived most of her adult life in proximity to the people she loved. She married young, had 2 daughters, and worked in the medical field. Co-workers described her as reliable and quiet, not one to stir conflict. Family said she was the kind of person who put others first, sometimes to her own disadvantage. At the time of her disappearance, Jennifer was in the early stages of separation from her husband, Dean Penny. Dean had worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, in the past, giving him insight into how investigations unfold and what investigators prioritize. By 2016, he had left law enforcement. Jennifer had moved back in with her father weeks before she went missing. There was no history of police calls to the Penny home, no public record of physical violence between the couple, but friends reported that Jennifer had confided in them about feeling watched and feeling uncomfortable in her own home. A note later recovered from a friend's messages read, "He doesn't yell. He waits. He watches. I don't sleep well when I'm here." That message came just 9 days before she disappeared. Jennifer didn't have any known enemies. She had no financial problems, no erratic behavior, no criminal associations. Her life was, by all accounts, stable until it wasn't. Her recent efforts were focused on building independence. She'd been attending counseling, considering a career change, and making decisions about shared custody of her youngest child. In forensic terms, this is where behavior analysis becomes relevant. Victimology isn't just about how a person lived, but about what made them vulnerable. What dynamics existed in their relationships that might escalate into danger. In Jennifer's case, there were patterns investigators didn't ignore. She had returned to her estranged husband's house on November 30th to care for their daughter. It wasn't unusual. The arrangement had been repeated multiple times without issue, but people close to her said she'd grown increasingly uncomfortable about being alone in that house. On November 26th, she told her sister she was feeling pressured to maintain civility, that she couldn't say no to requests without fearing some kind of fallout. There was no elaboration. The statement was vague, but it lingered. 4 days later, she disappeared. Digital forensics showed Jennifer's last known phone activity occurred at the Penny home that evening. Her search history in the days leading up to it included phrases like separation safety, emotional manipulation, and legal support for women leaving. While none of these searches are damning, they provide a psychological footprint. What she was thinking about, what worried her. The absence of direct threats or prior incidents made the case more difficult to escalate early. But as one investigator later commented in internal notes, she didn't file a complaint. That doesn't mean she wasn't being harmed. Jennifer's family provided extensive background support to the investigation. They handed over text messages, letters, and even voicemails. The tone in many of her messages was cautious, measured, even guarded. There was no explosive accusation, but there was an unmistakable pattern of restraint. She rarely used names when discussing disagreements. She referred to tense moments only with phrases like the usual or not again. Behavioral analysts from the RCMP later identified this as indicative of what's often called learned compliance, the way victims of long-term coercion adapt to keep peace. Investigators flagged this as significant but stopped short of using it as conclusive evidence. In forensic terms, it's context, not proof. Still, it reframed how her disappearance was perceived inside the task force. Jennifer wasn't just missing. She may have been isolated long before she vanished. In towns like St. Anthony, people often assume they know everything about each other. But the most dangerous dynamics don't always leave bruises. They leave silence. Jennifer had stopped talking openly about her marriage long before she packed her bags and moved back in with her father. Her daughters, especially the older one, were initially kept from media. Later, her eldest daughter made a public statement that caught national attention. "I just want my mom. I want to know she didn't suffer." That statement reframed the public response. It also reminded the press and investigators alike that the absence of physical violence in a relationship doesn't mean there wasn't a slow, ongoing erosion of safety. From a procedural standpoint, investigators shifted strategy in early December 2016. Rather than continue wide-area searches, they began to focus on behavioral forensics and reconstructing Jennifer's final 72 hours. That included her locations, conversations, phone activity, and changes in her tone when texting family. What they uncovered wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, deliberate withdrawal. Jennifer had been preparing, emotionally and practically, for the next stage of her life. That timeline ended the night she agreed to watch her daughter in the house she had left behind. When people ask why she would go back, the answer is frustratingly simple. She didn't want her daughter alone. She didn't want conflict. She didn't think it would be the night she disappeared. When the RCMP entered 21 Husky Drive on the morning of December 1st, 2016, the house didn't look like the scene of a crime. That was the first problem. The second was that it didn't look like a place anyone had left voluntarily either. There were no signs of forced entry, no windows cracked open, no visible signs of violence. The interior was quiet, organized, clean, but not freshly scrubbed. Jennifer's personal items were intact. Her coat was still hanging on the hook near the door. Her phone was face down on the dining table, battery still at 42%. The lights in the kitchen were on. The coffee machine had water inside but hadn't been used. The initial sweep didn't find much. But as any seasoned investigator knows, it's not always about what's there, it's about what doesn't add up. According to Dean Penny's account, he had left the house between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m. on November 30th to go duck hunting at a cabin roughly 40 minutes outside of town. He told police Jennifer had agreed to stay overnight to watch their youngest daughter. He said he returned the next day around midday and found her gone. That was his version. But cell data, router activity, and home environment analysis began pulling apart the timeline. Jennifer's phone last connected to the home Wi-Fi at 8:52 p.m. Her iCloud account registered a message sync at 9:03 p.m., consistent with a read receipt from her sister. Then all communication stopped. No more messages, no calls, no activity. At 10:06 p.m., the Wi-Fi router briefly disconnected. It was restarted roughly 8 hours later. No other device in the home showed usage during that time window. The gap caught attention. Investigators requested surveillance footage from the neighborhood. 2 nearby homes had exterior cameras. One had a partial view of the Penny driveway. That footage showed Dean's vehicle leaving the house just after 7:30 p.m., consistent with his claim. No other activity was visible between then and early morning, but there was no footage of Jennifer leaving, no cars pulled into the driveway, no motion around the front door, no pedestrian movement in or out. RCMP then initiated a timeline reconstruction, plotting every known movement of both Jennifer and Dean within the 72 hours prior to the disappearance. Jennifer had clocked out from work at the hospital on Wednesday, November 30th at 4:42 p.m. She made a quick stop at a gas station near Route 430, where a security camera confirmed her presence. From there, she drove straight to Husky Drive. She arrived around 5:30 p.m. and parked in the driveway. That vehicle never moved again. When investigators examined the interior of the house more carefully, attention turned to the laundry room and back hallway. Luminol testing showed a faint, incomplete pattern on the flooring, no visible blood, but enough to warrant deeper lab testing. The pattern wasn't conclusive. It didn't resemble a cleanup, nor did it appear to be the result of an injury, but the presence of organic trace suggested activity had taken place. The issue was, no one could say what kind. A search warrant for Dean's vehicle was considered but not executed immediately due to lack of probable cause. His consent was not given voluntarily. According to procedural notes, he had retained legal counsel by December 2nd and declined further questioning. This changed the approach. Investigators focused on the timeline. Dean's hunting cabin was verified. He had been there the following morning when contacted by police, and the location was consistent with cell tower data and weather conditions that limited access. However, forensic analysts noted that a gap remained, a 2-hour window between 7:30 and 9:30 p.m., during which his whereabouts could not be independently confirmed. While his vehicle left the property, there was no third-party verification of when it arrived at the cabin or how long it was en route. Snowfall that night made tracking unreliable. There were no tolls, no CCTV checkpoints between the Penny residence and the cabin. Back at the house, additional forensic analysis was conducted on Jennifer's phone. It had remained connected to the home network until the router was reset. Her message history was routine: family group texts, a few check-ins with coworkers, nothing alarming. But 2 messages had been composed and never sent, one at 9:08 p.m., the other at 9:11 p.m. Both were short and incomplete. Both were deleted drafts. The first began with, "Hey, can I call you?" The second, "He's still here." That phrase led investigators to believe that someone had remained in the house longer than expected, or returned. But digital evidence can only go so far without context. That's why procedural notes at this phase began emphasizing behavioral inconsistencies. Why did Jennifer leave her purse behind if she was stepping out? Why didn't she take her car? Why wasn't the bedding in the guest room disturbed? If she went missing outside the house, there were no physical indicators. If something happened inside, there was no trauma evidence. This stalemate moved the case into the realm of structured forensic suspicion. RCMP initiated a canvassing operation, interviewing 27 residents within a 2-block radius. No one reported hearing shouting. No one saw unusual activity. But one neighbor did say that around 10:15 p.m., their dog barked aggressively for several minutes, something it hadn't done in months. They didn't report it at the time because they hadn't seen anything. By December 3rd, the case was no longer being treated as a routine missing persons file. It was now categorized as suspected foul play, unknown cause. Major Crimes Unit from St. John's was brought in for advisory review. Internal communications show one phrase repeated in summary reports: no signs of life, no signs of death, no signs of departure, which, in most homicide investigations, points to concealment. Notably, Dean did not attend any of the initial community search events. He did not issue a public statement. That, again, wasn't illegal, but it was tracked. His behavior remained under scrutiny, but no charges were filed. Not then, not yet. By the end of the first week, the facts were clear. Jennifer was last seen entering the house on November 30th. No confirmed sightings or evidence of departure. Her phone, keys, and belongings remained inside. 2 unsent messages suggested concern or hesitation. No third-party DNA was recovered in the home. Dean's timeline had a gap, but the gap wasn't big enough to act on. Investigators needed more. As one officer noted during a closed-door meeting, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In homicide investigations, alibis don't stand on their own. They're only as strong as the evidence that supports them or the evidence that contradicts them. In the case of Jennifer Hillier Penny, the cabin became the focal point of that contradiction. According to Dean Penny, he left the house at approximately 7:30 p.m. on November 30th, 2016. He stated that he was heading to a family-owned hunting cabin roughly 35 miles outside St. Anthony. That detail never changed. He told it to officers at the scene. He repeated it during the initial interviews, and legally, it lined up. Dean's truck was confirmed on exterior surveillance leaving his residence. Tire impressions near the cabin, which were partially covered by overnight snow, supported that a vehicle had arrived. Weather data showed a heavy snow front moving in after 9:30 p.m. Cell tower hits from his phone were consistent with movement northward. No pings returned after 10:20 p.m., which investigators determined was either a signal drop, common in that area, or a manual phone shutdown. Still, something didn't sit right. When RCMP began reconstructing the timeline using GPS metadata from his truck's onboard system, the first inconsistency appeared. The vehicle's ignition was recorded at 7:28 p.m., and location data confirmed it left the Penny residence. But the GPS system did not record a final park or shutdown until 9:47 p.m. It took nearly 2.5 hours to cover a route that, in good conditions, required just under 50 minutes. The weather couldn't explain that. The roads had not yet iced over. There were no reported slowdowns, no recorded stops along the way. The route itself, isolated but direct, had no detours, tolls, or delays. So what accounted for the 90-minute discrepancy? Investigators mapped the surrounding area within a 2-mile radius of the highway corridor between Husky Drive and the cabin, forest. The gravel service roads, one abandoned structure, and a quarry access road that ran out to a drainage basin, roughly 800 meters off the main route. That's when the focus shifted. Search teams were dispatched to canvass that stretch, slow, methodical. Canine units were brought back into rotation. A cadaver dog from Nova Scotia was flown in the following week under the assumption that if concealment had occurred, it may have taken place en route, not at the cabin or the house. Still, no body, no clothing, no physical remains, but they did find something else. Near the quarry basin, an area covered in thin snow but with several exposed patches of damp rock, investigators recovered a partially degraded plastic glove wedged between brush and stone. DNA analysis later confirmed that the glove had epithelial material matching Dean Penny's profile. There was no trace of Jennifer's DNA, no blood, no other human tissue. The glove itself wasn't conclusive. It could have been from any number of activities. Dean hunted, he cleaned gear, he had reason to use disposable gloves, but the timing, placement, and location raised red flags, particularly since Dean had never mentioned stopping anywhere during that drive. Another detail, his truck's floor mat contained a minor soil mismatch. The cabin's driveway was primarily moss and gravel. The compound on the mat contained fine silt with high quartz content, typical of crushed rock used in quarry surfacing, not found at the cabin location. Again, not damming, but not aligning. RCMP's Forensic Environmental Unit logged these as non-exclusionary materials. In plain terms, nothing directly tied to a crime, but nothing that ruled it out either. It suggested unaccounted activity, a possible detour, a piece of a narrative no one was telling. Back at the cabin, a forensic team documented the interior. It was sparsely furnished, wood stove, cot, gear racks. The area was undisturbed. No obvious signs of activity, but several items of interest were logged. First, the hunting journal, a simple notepad often used to record weather, sightings, or personal notes, was blank. No entries from that night, no checklist, just a previous log from 5 days earlier. Second, the boots near the door were dry. If Dean had arrived around 10 p.m. during snowfall, investigators expected moisture, but the boots were clean, with no interior dampness. That suggested either he hadn't used them, or he had left them there earlier and arrived in another pair. The third detail came from the burn barrel. Wood ash analysis showed that a fire had been started during the early morning hours of December 1st. Forensic testing determined the fire had been used to burn trash, mostly food packaging, paper towels, and one unidentifiable fabric scrap. The contents were too degraded for conclusive matching, but the presence of high nitrate accelerants indicated the fire had been built hotter than normal. A lab report noted, unusual combustion pattern for typical warming fire. Possible secondary disposal purpose cannot be excluded. With that, the cabin transitioned from alibi anchor point to area of interest. It wasn't enough for an arrest. It wasn't enough for a search warrant extension. But it shifted the posture of the case. Dean Penny's narrative was intact, but now it was surrounded by unexplained gaps. As one senior investigator put it later, off the record, "You don't always need a lie. Sometimes the silence around the truth is what does it." In major case investigations, especially suspected homicides, one element weighs heavier than any theory: the absence of a body. No victim, no scene, no clear cause of death. In the Jennifer Hillier Penny case, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the central barrier. By early 2017, the RCMP had already treated the case as a probable homicide. Internally, it had moved past the label of missing person. But without remains, without cause of death, the case remained legally incomplete. Forensics had yielded inconsistencies. Behavioral indicators pointed toward coercion and control. Dean's timeline didn't hold up in full. Still, the system required a definitive break, something physical, and it hadn't come. In January 2017, search efforts re-engaged along Route 430, focusing on access roads, gravel pits, and forested pull-off areas between Husky Drive and the cabin. The RCMP deployed sonar teams to scan frozen inlets along the coast, aided by infrared aerial imaging. Cadaver dogs ran secondary searches over previously scanned zones. No hits, no remains, nothing surfaced. Technicians logged hours scanning topsoil, creek beds, drainage pipes, even partially frozen bogland west of the main road. Data collected pointed to disturbed ground in several locations, but none consistent enough to warrant excavation. Environmental degradation, winter erosion, and snow compaction made it nearly impossible to determine whether the ground had been tampered with days earlier or weeks before. A forensic anthropologist brought in from Halifax provided this in a field report. Cold region concealments leave minimal surface disturbance after 72 hours. If she was buried shallow, that window has already closed. With traditional recovery methods exhausted, investigators shifted focus to indirect indicators. Trash collection routes were reviewed, all disposal records from St. Anthony and surrounding towns between December 1st and December 5th were obtained and manually examined. Dozens of bags were opened. Nothing was recovered. Attention then turned back to the residence. 3 weeks after the disappearance, RCMP obtained a secondary warrant for a full ground-penetrating radar scan around the exterior of Dean's property. They focused on disturbed gravel patches near the shed and rear tree line. No anomalies of concern were found. Beneath the frost layer, soil composition remained undisturbed. There was no evidence of post-hole digging, trenching, or recent burial. Inside the home, a flooring specialist was brought in to assess subfloor disruptions in 2 rooms, the back hallway and the utility area. While minor irregularities were found, they were attributed to water damage dating back over a year. No voids, no trace blood under flooring, no evidence of hidden compartments or tampering. The evidence remained circumstantial, but heavy. By the 5th month of investigation, the case file had crossed 400 pages. Interviews, search logs, environmental forensics, expert consultation reports, all building pressure without a physical result. The frustration wasn't unique. Across Canada, fewer than 15% of bodyless homicide investigations result in prosecution. That statistic weighed heavily on the lead investigator assigned at the time. According to internal notes, he described the file as case-rich but court-poor, a term used when evidence is meaningful but not admissible or decisive. But the team didn't back off. They reassessed strategy. Forensic analysts began reinvestigating Jennifer's digital life. If her physical body couldn't be found, perhaps her digital footprint could provide a secondary map. Investigators pulled her iCloud logs again, this time looking beyond texts, into deleted photos, synced files, and app usage. One anomaly stood out. On the morning of November 30th, hours before she disappeared, Jennifer's Notes app contained a draft entry titled "Only Tuesday." The file was time-stamped and auto-saved but contained no written content. The title was unusual. That day had been a Wednesday. It wasn't evidence, but it offered a clue. Jennifer had kept personal notes there before. She used the app to record grocery lists, reminders, sometimes reflections. The entry had been created but abandoned. The RCMP digital forensics team couldn't determine whether she had deleted content from it or never started writing, but the metadata showed she'd opened it at 9:42 a.m., then locked her phone a minute later. Again, not proof, but patterns matter, especially in silence. By late spring 2017, the investigative team began experiencing fatigue. The public was still engaged. Jennifer's face remained on flyers, but tips had slowed. The search efforts had narrowed to archival review. And with no body, there were limits to how long public pressure could sustain momentum. Internally, investigators debated whether to present the case to Crown prosecutors as a bodyless murder. Some believed the timeline and digital inconsistencies warranted charges. Others warned it wouldn't survive cross-examination. Without remains, any defense could argue alternative theory: accident, voluntary disappearance, or third-party involvement. In many jurisdictions, prosecutions have succeeded without a body. But those cases often involve confessions, witness testimony, or irrefutable digital trails. This case had neither. The RCMP chose not to file charges. Instead, they kept the case open as unsolved but active. Jennifer was still missing. Dean was not cooperating, and the file remained frozen between suspicion and proof. As one investigator later stated, the file didn't close, it just hardened. For nearly 7 months, the investigation into Catherine Matthews' disappearance had moved in circles, methodical, exhaustive, but largely fruitless. But in July 2017, a measurable shift occurred. A pattern that had remained static began to move. The catalyst wasn't forensic or even technological. It came through a combination of procedural persistence and one minor but telling mistake. The mistake came from within the digital review process. While combing through historical GPS data pulled from the primary suspect's truck, data that had previously been reviewed but not deeply cross-referenced, an analyst with the Alberta RCMP noticed a discrepancy in the deletion timestamps. The suspect's GPS data had been wiped on December 1, 2016, but forensics showed the GPS had logged one more location after that deletion, a remote clearing approximately 11.3 kilometers from the cabin, marked on the device at 3:42 a.m. on December 2nd. It was a location not previously searched, buried deep behind unmarked oil service roads. Investigators moved quickly. A specialized cadaver search team was dispatched, including 2 canine units trained to detect human decomposition. Soil was tested for trace elements commonly left behind by buried remains: calcium phosphate, potassium, and elevated bacterial degradation. The dogs marked once, then again. The soil registered anomalies consistent with disturbed earth, though no body was recovered. Still, the new location broke the stalemate. It introduced probable cause. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to reopen other leads that had previously gone cold due to lack of corroboration. Following that break, attention returned to the digital environment, specifically a reassessment of the suspect's online presence. In particular, his iCloud backup contained a cache of deleted photos that had not been fully overwritten. A single image dated November 16, 2016, 3 days before Catherine's last sighting, showed a narrow view of her face, bruising visible along the jawline. The image had been cropped. Its metadata showed it had been sent once, then deleted. Forensic analysts worked to restore the cropped portions. Using pixel reconstruction and mirror image pattern analysis, they determined Catherine had been photographed while sitting in a small, confined space, possibly a storage area. While the image alone was not criminal evidence, it became a critical narrative point in establishing timeline pressure. The RCMP reached out to the manufacturer of the suspect's truck and obtained satellite imagery from onboard OnStar logs, which retained engine idling patterns. One anomaly stood out. The engine had idled for 2 hours and 36 minutes in that same clearing where the GPS anomaly had been logged. There was no record of phone activity during that time, and no calls made until hours later. This was the first time investigators could place the suspect in a probable disposal site, with timing that matched both disappearance and vehicle behavior. Yet still, the legal threshold for prosecution wasn't met. Without a body and without direct confession, the case was structurally weak in court. In interviews, investigators expressed frustration. We could show means, motive, and opportunity, but not the final link, the body, or a direct witness. Backtracking further, investigators re-interviewed close associates. One of the suspect's former colleagues, a seasonal welder, came forward and admitted that, in late November, the suspect had asked him offhandedly, "How deep do you think frost goes this time of year if you're trying to dig something in?" The man had thought it was a crude joke. At the time, he didn't report it. Individually, none of these details were enough. But collectively, they formed a new version of the timeline, one increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence. This chapter also revealed the critical fragility of digital evidence. Unlike a body, it can't be buried or burned, but it can be ignored. That one GPS ping, overlooked for months, shifted the entire shape of the investigation. And it's here that the broader lesson emerges. In long-form criminal investigations, breakthroughs rarely arrive through drama. They arrive through quiet inconsistency, tiny missteps, trace artifacts, or deleted data that refuses to stay silent. Following the GPS anomaly and the partial image recovery, the Alberta RCMP knew they had entered a different phase of the case. The challenge was no longer identifying the suspect, he had been consistent from the beginning, but building a prosecutable timeline that would stand in court. And to do that, they needed one more thing, a break in behavior. The suspect had, until that point, complied with every interview under legal guidance. His answers were careful, limited to what could not be disproven, and he never volunteered details. But after forensic technicians isolated the vehicle's engine idle pattern from December 2nd, the case commander authorized a fourth interview, this time under what they called a controlled confrontation strategy. The suspect was brought in under pretext, a procedural clarification regarding the property boundary near the cabin. The initial tone was informal. But 37 minutes in, the lead investigator presented a color-enhanced thermal map of the vehicle's location from December 2nd. Without saying it was evidence of a crime, they asked, "Can you explain why the truck remained parked here, off-grid, in the middle of the night for over 2.5 hours?" The suspect paused, then offered, "I think I might have gone there to think. Catherine and I had argued the day before." When asked about phone data, he claimed the battery had died. When pressed further about the soil anomaly, he looked down, then simply said, "I don't remember." Investigators didn't expect a confession. What they were looking for was inconsistency, and they got it. Prior interviews had described that night as uneventful and spent in bed. Now, the narrative had shifted. That contradiction became a pivot point. Over the next 3 weeks, forensic specialists reprocessed the suspect's boots, confiscated during the original property search. This time, they used a new reagent designed to detect trace levels of decomposing organic compounds in clay-based soils. A positive match came back for adipocere, a waxy substance formed from human fat under anaerobic conditions. The boots had been cleaned, but the residue, deep in the tread pattern, matched the soil composition from the clearing. While not definitive evidence of a body, it was enough to warrant a targeted excavation. Under court order, the RCMP conducted a controlled dig at the site. Stratified layers were removed down to 2.4 feet. A scent article was used to direct cadaver dogs. The dogs gave repeated alerts within a specific quadrant. Bone fragments were eventually recovered, non-diagnostic, weathered, but sent for mitochondrial DNA matching. By this stage, the lead investigator noted in his internal memo, "We are no longer dealing with a disappearance. We are operating under the presumption of homicide." Publicly, the case remained listed as a missing person. Privately, the Crown Prosecutor's Office had been briefed. With DNA pending, they began outlining a potential circumstantial homicide case built on 3 pillars: behavioral inconsistency, forensic residue, and digital suppression. But the biggest development came from a civilian witness who had not been considered central until she reached out again. A friend of Catherine's, previously dismissed as not possessing relevant knowledge, called investigators to say she had remembered something strange. On November 17th, the day before Catherine was last seen, the friend had received a short audio message from her. Catherine had been crying and whispered something about needing to hide something important. The file had been deleted, but her cloud app still stored a backup log of the transmission, showing it had been sent at 11:17 p.m. The RCMP retrieved the log. Though the audio could not be recovered, the timestamp aligned perfectly with the window in which Catherine's movements were last known. Suddenly, it wasn't just about what happened after she vanished. It was about the decisions she may have made, just hours before she disappeared, that triggered the chain of events. As the suspect remained under surveillance, the case moved closer to its prosecutorial threshold. All that remained was final confirmation, a match between the recovered bone fragments and Catherine's mitochondrial profile. I stood outside the county courthouse on a crisp March morning, watching the press gather behind metal barricades. It had been over a year since Catherine Matthew vanished from her Peoria home, 13 months marked by unanswered calls, silent birthdays, and soil turned over in search of truth. Now, the silence was over. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with the procedural weight of justice. No theatrics, no confessions screamed through tears, just facts, presented with precision, backed by physical evidence too solid to ignore. The partial human remains unearthed behind the garage, confirmed by DNA analysis to belong to Catherine, were no longer suspected. They were conclusive. The jawbone, the dental plate, the fragment of a fractured femur, all lined up with the medical records of a woman who once smiled easily in family photos and had vanished without a trace. The forensic pathologist's report left no ambiguity. Catherine's remains showed signs of blunt force trauma consistent with a domestic altercation. There were also microfractures in the left temporal bone that could not have been caused post-mortem. Her time of death, estimated within a window in early January 2024, aligned with the last digital activity recorded from her phone, and more crucially, with the window when neighbors reported hearing something off in the garage late one night. But even more damning were the digital footprints. Deleted text messages, recovered from backups, revealed escalating tension between Catherine and her husband, Thomas Matthew. One message, time-stamped just 4 days before her disappearance, read, "You always said you'd never let me leave. That's not love. That's a threat." In court, the prosecution didn't need a motive wrapped in emotion. They had patterns. Financial records showed a suspicious withdrawal the morning after Catherine was last seen, made from her account but using Thomas's IP address. Surveillance footage captured him buying lime, gloves, and plastic tarp 2 days prior, purchases he initially denied during the preliminary interview. When the shovel found buried beside the remains was examined, it revealed trace DNA consistent with Catherine's blood, embedded in the rust near the joint. It was not speculation, it was science. And yet Thomas pleaded not guilty. The defense argued a lack of direct witnesses and framed the circumstantial case as weak. But the jury didn't buy it. After 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict came in, guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom remained still as the foreperson read the word. Thomas showed no emotion, not shock, not regret, just the same blank mask he'd worn through every proceeding. He was sentenced to 42 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 30. There was no applause, no vindication, only the slow exhale of a community that had been holding its breath for too long. I spoke with a detective after the sentencing, off the record. He said something that stuck with me. Sometimes it's not a twist. It's just a slow crawl toward the truth. That's still justice. And that's what this was. No dramatic reveal, no last-minute witness, just steady, painful truth assembled piece by piece until it formed a picture clear enough for the law to act. Catherine's family did not speak to the media. Their grief was private, but through a brief statement, they said they were grateful her name was no longer listed among the missing. That alone speaks volumes. For families of the disappeared, even the worst truth is better than endless questions. What I take from this case, what I hope you take too, is that silence can be deadly. If something feels wrong, sounds wrong, is wrong, don't wait until it's too late. Catherine's story reminds us that danger doesn't always come as a stranger. It can come quietly, behind closed doors, dressed as love or obligation. If you've ever felt trapped in fear or dismissed for speaking up, know this: your voice matters. You matter. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, or even why it resonated with you. And if it didn't, Tell me why. I welcome all perspectives. I read every comment. And if you're still here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next story. There's more truth to uncover, together.